Hello and welcome to another fantasy lore video, and today we are going to take a closer look at why archers would be extremely powerful in most fantasy worlds. But before we're going to take a closer look at any of this, let me quickly thank my Patreons for supporting this channel, as well as say thanks to all users of the YouTube thanks function for making one-time donations. And with that said, let's get to the topic at hand. Magic is often used in fantasy and anime worlds to make one's body indestructible, overwhelmingly strong, or at the very least, to gain a cool glowing red eye. Whether it's enormous spells or overpowered swords, whose shockwaves alone can slice mountain peaks, magic is not only visually spectacular, but also fundamentally changes the dynamic of one-on-one combat. But there's one fantasy weapon that could become absurdly powerful with just a bit of magic enhancement: the bow. Let's start with what I mean. If swords alone are capable of unleashing magical shockwaves and blades with a single swing can cut enemies in half from a distance of a dozen meters or so, then dedicated ranged weapons should, logically, be even more devastating when enhanced in the same way, because again, they are purpose-built for dealing ranged damage. And this brings us to the core point: even without magic, bows were incredibly effective and deadly. Just think about the Battle of Agincourt, where longbowmen decimated the French cavalry that got stuck in the mud. The longbow was even so feared that people used to cut off the fingers of captured archers, the ones needed to draw the bowstring. And this is also where the so-called English salute comes from, where the archer raises their index and their middle fingers as to say, "You want my fingers? Come and take them." And the Mongolian composite bow, combined with cavalry tactics, were equally devastating, because even if the infantry would normally have finally caught up with the enemy cavalry, it would just withdraw a couple of meters and while continuing to fire from their bows. So again, it was utterly devastating. And this all comes down to the very basic advantage of range. While a skilled fantasy swordsman has to block his opponent's blade again and again, or enemy incoming arrows, which, to be fair, is an impressive feat on its own, a bowman doesn't even need to be near the enemy, so he can't be struck with a sword. He can instead strike while remaining at a safe distance, untouched by the enemy. And sure, some fantasy warriors like the Swordsman of Hoeth from Warhammer Fantasy can actually deflect arrows with their swords. But even then they can't counterattack, because the archer is still far, far away. And to be fair, this is nothing more than the equivalent of a good shield wall. While you are protected, there's still the possibility that some arrows might sneak through, and you are still a target, a sitting duck, only just one that is well armored. And this alone would already be a huge advantage in any fantasy world, one that would only be amplified if bows were enhanced or enchanted with magical power. Imagine arrows that seek their targets, or at least autocorrect their trajectory by a few degrees. Imagine exploding, burning, or lightning-charged arrows that would paralyze the enemy on impact, even through shields. Imagine what kind of potent poisons there must be in great abundance, for example if basilisks were a thing, so their venom alone could probably destroy a whole squad of enemy units, if a couple of it is just liberally dispersed above their heads. And of course, some arrows might even be able to track their targets through the air, like if they had a will of their very own, granted to them temporarily by magic. And all of that would already be extremely terrifying, but on top of that, magical bows could offer an even greater range and even greater accuracy, making them lethal across the entire battlefields, making them essentially the equivalent, at the very least, the equivalent to modern bullets or even artillery fire. Bows that can hit effectively from kilometers away would be an absolute game changer for any army, even if the arrows themselves aren't magical, especially when the archers are highly mobile, either on foot or horseback, or perhaps the back of a hippogriff, or a dragon. And sword fighting might be stylish, shields might be thicker, But the fact remains, with that kind of long-range massed killing potential, fantasy battlefields would resemble that of World War I more than medieval skirmishes. Simply put, when both sides develop range superiority, close combat and charges become suicide missions. And the best example of all of this might be Nea Baraya from the anime and light novel series Overlord. She received an overpowered bow from the undead overlord Ein Gon, and being a naturally talented archer, used it to massively influence her section of the battlefield. She managed to take out several dozen of powerful enemies with a hail of arrows, and reportedly defeating 50 to 100 soldiers single-handedly before finally running out of arrows and being overwhelmed in close combat. Had she had more arrows, or if more archers had been equipped with normal enchanted bows, the army of Jalabov would have suffered far more severe losses. Not that he cares, but the fact remains, Nea's effectiveness was so great that after being resurrected as a holy archer, she went on to establish an elite long-ranged unit of her own. In other words, a single magical bow in the hands of a skilled archer can cause immense destruction. A massed barrage from archers stationed behind walls or atop mountains become a death sentence for any advancing army so long as there's enough ammunition. And of course, as long as the arrows are actually magically enchantable. And if we remember that in Overlord, there's actually a bow that shoots arrows made out of sunlight, then we realize some of these logistical issues could literally be solved through magic. So this time, at the start of any conflict, there would be for once no shortage of ammunition. Especially because normal arrows could be reused quite effectively, which can't be said of artillery shells. And personally, I think that in high fantasy worlds, melee combat would revolve more around dealing with archers. Think of infiltration missions that might aim to destroy bows and quivers, and of course the arrows. Rogues might try to force archers into close combat by ambushing them. Or perhaps even more magic is needed to counter archers, because mages might target them with wasp swarms, poisonous fog, or elementals could be sent out to attack them that are entirely immune to arrows, like water or fire elementals, for whom physical arrows means little, since they are literally just fire and water that is animated by magic. So that's why bows in fantasy worlds could be absolutely dominating on the battlefield, if given the chance. And with that said, now it's your turn. What do you think about this video and about the power and the potential weaknesses of magical bows? Do you think they would be really that overpowered, or do you think that in a magical fantasy world there would be plenty of options to basically for just a normal magical trained infantryman to counter the arrows? Let me know it down in the comment section. And with that said, I say thank you very much for watching, thanks to all of my subscribers.